The Galactic Union's Interspecies Youth Academy floated in the darkness of space like a jewel made of light and metal, and inside its gleaming halls walked creatures from 100 different worlds who had come to learn and grow together under one. Roof Station Velar 7 was famous across 12 star systems for bringing young minds together, and the Academy took great pride in teaching students to understand species that were nothing like themselves. There were the Theshans, with their beautiful crystalline skin that caught the light and scattered rainbows across the walls when they moved. And there were the massive Gorvani who stood 8 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms and deep voices that rumbled like distant thunder. The Polari moved in groups of 5 or 6 because their herd instincts made them nervous when they were alone. And the Veth communicated through colors that rippled across their translucent bodies like living paintings. And then there was Mira Chun. She was 17 years old with dark hair that she kept tied back in a simple ponytail and brown eyes that watched everything with quiet curiosity. And she was the only human in the entire xenobiology program. Humans were still new to the galactic community, and most species did not know what to make of them yet. The orientation materials that the Academy sent to incoming students contained a special section about humans that read like a warning label on something. Dangerous humans originate from Earth, a Class 12 death world. The materials explained in serious tones that made Mira laugh when she first read them. Their homeworld has extreme gravity, a caustic oxygen-rich atmosphere, and is populated by millions of species of dangerous predators and venomous creatures. The materials went on to describe how humans were persistent predators who had evolved to chase their prey for hours until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and how they had somehow survived their deadly world by forming bonds with other dangerous creatures. Humans bond with anything. One section warned in what seemed like genuine concern. They have been observed forming emotional attachments to robots, to plants, to inanimate objects, and most disturbingly to predators that could easily kill them. The final warning was perhaps the strangest of all. Humans find danger exciting and will often seek it out for entertainment. Mira had found the whole thing both funny and a little sad, because she did not feel like a scary predator. From a death world, she felt like a teenager who was far from home and struggling to make friends. Her classmates were polite to her, but they kept their distance. And she understood why, even if it still hurt the Polari, students would flinch whenever they noticed her eyes, because humans had forward-facing eyes like hunters, and the Polari were prey species whose eyes sat on the sides of their heads. The Theshans seemed worried that she might accidentally break them because humans were dense and heavy compared to their delicate frames. And even the mighty Govani treated her with careful respect that felt more like wariness than friendship. Myra ate her meals alone most days at a small table near the window where she could watch the stars drift past. And she studied alone in her quarters, and she walked to class alone through corridors that seemed to empty slightly whenever she appeared. She told herself that things would get better with time, that her classmates would eventually see that she was not a monster from a nightmare world, but just a girl who loved animals and wanted to learn about the incredible creatures that filled the galaxy. Today was supposed to be a good day because Professor Thelix had announced that the xenobiology class would be taking a field trip to the Fauna Preservation Wing. The Fauna Wing was Mira's favorite place on the entire station because it housed creatures from dozens of different worlds, and she had spent many of her free hours there just watching and learning. But today's visit was special because they would be observing something that most students never got to see up close. A Vorathi Shadowcat. Mira had read everything she could find about Shadowcats, and the information made her heart race with excitement rather than fear. They were apex predators from a restricted world called Vorathi Prime. and they were considered one of the most dangerous species in the known galaxy. Their fur was so black that it seemed to drink in light itself, and their eyes glowed like molten copper in the darkness. They had 6 powerful limbs that let them move with terrifying speed and grace, and their claws could slice through starship hull plating like it was soft fabric. Galactic Union only allowed a handful of Shadowcats to exist in captivity, and they were kept under the highest security protocols for research purposes. Only Professor Thelix gathered the class outside the observation room, and his deep Gavani voice rumbled through the group like a gentle earthquake. Today you will observe a Varathi Shadowcat matriarch through reinforced barriers, he announced with all 4 of his arms clasped behind his back. You will remain calm, and you will stay behind the safety line at all times. He paused, and his large eyes swept across the students with serious weight. There is no danger as long as everyone follows the rules. The observation room was impressive, with 3 inches of plasma-reinforced glass separating the viewing area from the enclosure beyond, and the students filed in with nervous energy crackling between them. Myra found a spot near the front because she wanted the best view possible, and she noticed that most of her classmates pressed themselves against the back wall as far from the glass as they could get. The enclosure beyond the glass was designed to look like a dark forest with twisted trees and deep shadows. And somewhere in that artificial darkness waited the matriarch. Then Mira saw her, the Shadowcat, emerge from the shadows. Like a piece of the night itself had decided to move. And she was the most beautiful and terrifying thing that Myra had ever seen. 6 limbs carried her massive form with liquid grace as she paced along the edge of her territory, and her void black fur rippled with each movement like darkness made solid. Her eyes found the glass and the students beyond it, and those molten copper orbs held an intelligence that made Myra's breath catch in her throat. This was not just an animal, this was a queen in her domain. Ancient and powerful and utterly magnificent, Mira pressed her hand against the glass without thinking and whispered words that no one else could hear. You are so beautiful. The matriarch's ears twitched as if she had somehow heard, and for just a moment, those copper eyes seemed to focus on the small human girl, who looked at her not with fear but with wonder. Neither of them knew that in just a few minutes everything would change forever. Professor Thelix moved to his control console near the observation window, and his 4 hands danced across it holographic interface as he pulled up data about the magnificent creature pacing beyond the glass. The Varathi Shadowcat is considered the apex predator of its homeworld, he lectured in his rumbling voice, while the matriarch continued her endless patrol. A single adult can bring down prey 10 times its size, and they have been known to hunt in complete darkness using senses that we still do not fully understand. The students listened with wide eyes and trembling limbs, and Mira noticed that several of the Pelori had clustered together so tightly that they looked like one creature. With too many legs, she felt a pang of sympathy for them, because their instincts were screaming at them to run, even though the glass made them perfectly safe. However, Professor Thelix continued as he gestured toward a side door that Mira had not noticed before. Today's lesson is not about the matriarch. The side door slid open, and a handler walked in carrying a containment crate that was about the size of a large suitcase. The handler was a Theshan with pale blue, crystalline skin and nervous movements, and Myra could see the fear in every step they took. This is a Varathi Shadowcat cub, Professor Thelix announced as the handler set the crate down on an examination table. It is approximately 3 months old, and we will be performing routine biometric scans while you observe. Myra leaned forward with excitement bubbling in her chest, because baby animals were her absolute favorite thing in any galaxy. And even a baby apex predator was still a baby. The crate shook slightly and a low growling sound came from within. And Myra could see glimpses of void black fur through the ventilation slots. "The cub will be lightly sedated for the procedure," the professor explained as the handler prepared an injector. "This is standard protocol for the safety of both the handlers and the animal." The handler approached the crate and pressed the injector against one of the ventilation slots. And there was a soft hiss as the sedative was released. Everyone waited. The growling from inside the crate continued. The handler checked their instruments and frowned, and they exchanged a worried look with Professor Thelix that made Myra's stomach tighten with sudden concern. "The sedation does not appear to be taking effect," the handler said in a voice that trembled like wind chimes in a storm. "The cub's metabolism may be faster than our calculations predicted." Professor Thelix opened his mouth to respond, but he never got the chance. The crate exploded, not literally exploded, but it might as well have, because the cub inside launched itself against the walls with such force that the entire container flew off the table and crashed to the floor. The latches that had been designed to hold gave way under the desperate assault, and suddenly there was a shadowcat cub loose in the examination area. It was the size of a large dog with the same void black fur as its mother and eyes that burned like copper fire, and it was absolutely terrified. The cub slammed into walls and equipment as it tried to escape from the noise and the lights and the overwhelming sense of fear that filled the room. And its claws left deep gouges in everything they touched. The handler screamed and dove behind a console, and alarm sirens began to wail throughout the facility with piercing shrieks that only made the cub more frantic. Than something impossible happened. The containment field between the examination area and the observation room flickered. It was only for a heartbeat. Just a tiny gap in the energy barrier that separated the students from the chaos. But the cub moved faster than anyone could track. One moment it was in the chaos examination area, and the next moment it was crashing through the gap into the observation room, into the classroom, into a space filled with 23 students and no barriers at all. The chaos that followed was like nothing Mira had ever experienced. Session students shattered display screens as they fled in all directions, their crystalline bodies catching the alarm lights and throwing wild patterns across the walls. The Pelori stampeded toward the exits with their herd instincts taking over completely, and they crashed into each other and the walls and anything else in their path. The Gorvani students froze in place because that was how their species responded to sudden threats, their massive bodies becoming like statues while their minds tried to process what was happening. And the cub bounced from wall to wall in pure animal panic, slashing at shadows and screaming in a voice that sounded nothing like the fearsome predator it would someday become. It sounded like a baby crying for its mother. Mira watched all of this happen in what felt like slow motion, and something strange occurred inside her mind. She did not feel afraid. She felt sad. This was not a monster trying to kill them. This was a terrified child who had been ripped away from its mother and thrown into a nightmare of noise and chaos and the overwhelming stench of fear. Every single creature in the room was broadcasting pure terror through their pheromones and their body language and their screaming voices. And to the cub's heightened senses, it must have felt like being trapped in a tornado of threat signals. No wonder it was panicking. No wonder it was lashing out. It was just scared. Myra made a decision in that moment that she could not explain even to herself, and she dropped to her knees on the cold floor of the observation room. She made herself small. She controlled her breathing the way her father had taught her during meditation sessions back on Earth. Slow breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. She did not run. She did not scream. She did not freeze like prey or puff up like a predator. She simply stayed still and let her heartbeat slow and her fear fade away into something that felt almost like calm. The cub's rampage began to stutter as it circled the room, and its copper eyes swept across the chaos, looking for something that its panicked mind could not find. Safety comfort someone who was not afraid. Its head swung toward the one creature in the light room who was not screaming or running or frozen in terror, and those burning copper eyes locked onto Myra Chun with sudden focus. Professor Thelix watched from where he stood paralyzed at his console, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. "No." The cub approached the human girl in 3 wary bounds, its claws clicking against the floor, and its body still trembling with residual panic. Every instinct in the professor's body screamed that he was about to watch one of his students die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The cub circled Myra once, twice. It sniffed her outstretched hand with nostrils flaring, and its void black fur rippled with uncertainty as it processed what its senses were telling it. This creature was not afraid. This creature was calm. This creature smelled like safety, and then the most dangerous juvenile predator in the sector did something that made no sense at all. It collapsed against Myra's side like a puppet with its strings cut, pressing its trembling body into her warmth and making a sound that no Shadowcat had ever made for any non-Varathi creature, a low rumbling chirp that rose and fell like a song of distress. Kala baby, calling for comfort. Myra very slowly placed her hand on the cub's flank and felt the rapid heartbeat beneath that void black fur, and she whispered words that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. "Hey there, little one. It is okay. You are okay. I have got you." The cub's burning copper eyes drifted closed, and its breathing began to slow, and 22 students and 1 professor stared in absolute shock at the human girl who was cradling an apex predator like it was nothing more than a frightened kitten. The silence in the observation room was so complete that Myra could hear her own heartbeat and the soft breathing of the creature pressed against her side. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. 22 students stood, frozen in various states of interrupted panic, their eyes fixed on the impossible scene before them, with expressions that ranged from disbelief to terror to something that might have been a professor. Thelix remained at his console with all 4 of his massive arms hanging limp at his sides, and his mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out. The Shadowcat cub had curled itself around Myra like she was the only solid thing in a universe that had gone completely mad, and its void black fur rose and fell with each steadying breath. Myra kept her hand on the cub's flank and felt the wild heartbeat slowly beginning to calm beneath her palm, and she did not dare to move or speak loudly for fear of breaking whatever strange spell had fallen over this moment. The cub was warm against her, warmer than she had expected, and up close she could see that its fur was not truly black but rather a deep purple, so dark that it only showed its true color when the light hit it just right. Its claws were retracted now, but she could see the tips of them peeking out from its massive paws, and she understood with perfect clarity that those claws could have killed her in an instant if the cub had wanted to hurt. But it did not want to hurt her. It wanted to be safe. Myra understood that feeling better than anyone in the room could have guessed, because she had felt that same desperate need for safety and comfort during her first weeks on the station, when everything was strange and everyone was afraid of her. Being alone and scared was terrible, no matter what species you were. The cub made that chirping sound again and pressed its head against her chest, and Myra felt tears prick at her eyes because the sound was so full of need and trust. "I know," she whispered as she carefully stroked the cub's fur. "I know you are scared, but you are safe now, and I am not going anywhere." One of the Pelori students made a small sound of distress, and the cub's ears twitched, but it did not lift its head from Myra's chest. It had found its safe place, and it was not going to Lee Professor Thelix finally found his voice, and it came out rough and strange. Like he had forgotten how to speak. "Miss Chun," he said slowly. "Do not move." Myra almost laughed at that instruction because moving was the absolute last thing she planned to do. "I was not planning on it," she replied in that same soft voice she had been using. With the cub, the professor's hands began to move across his console again with shaking motions. That sent commands flying through the station's communication system, and within minutes, the observation room was surrounded by security teams and handlers and scientists, who all stared through the windows with the same shocked expressions. "How is this possible?" one of the scientists breathed as she watched the human girl comfort the most dangerous juvenile predator in the sector. Nobody had an answer. The matriarch in the enclosure beyond the glass had stopped pacing and was now pressed against the barrier with her copper eyes fixed on the scene in the observation room, and she made a low sound that rumbled through the floor like distant thunder. Myra glanced toward the great shadow cat and saw something in those ancient eyes that surprised her. It was not anger or fear or the hunting focus of a predator watching prey. It was something that looked almost like curiosity. The matriarch was watching Myra hold her cub, and she did not seem to view the human as a threat. One of the handlers approached the observation room door with a sedation rifle in his trembling hands, and Myra felt the cub tense against her as if it could sense the danger approaching. "Wait," she said in a voice that carried more command than she had intended. And everyone froze again. "If you try to sedate it now while it is scared, it will panic again," Myra explained as she continued her gentle stroking motions along the cub's flank. "Just give it a few more minutes to calm down." Professor Thelix stared at the human girl who was giving orders to train handlers while cradling an apex predator, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. The orientation materials had warned that humans were strange and unpredictable and possibly dangerous, but they had not mentioned anything about this. They had not mentioned that humans could look at a creature designed by evolution to be a perfect killing machine and see only a frightened child that needed comfort. The minutes stretched out like hours as Myra sat on the cold floor with the cub pressed against her, and slowly the tension in the room began to ease. The cub's breathing had become deep and regular, and its copper eyes stayed closed in something that looked like peaceful sleep. "I think it is okay now," Myra finally said, and her voice was tired but steady. "You can come in, but please be slow and quiet." The handlers entered the room like they were walking through a minefield, their movements exaggerated in their carefulness as they approached the impossible scene. The lead handler knelt down beside Myra and prepared a mild sedative that would ease the cub into a deeper sleep without causing the panic that the first attempt had triggered. "I need you to keep doing what you are doing," the handler whispered, and Myra nodded without taking her eyes off the cub. The injection was quick and gentle, and the cub barely stirred as the medication took effect. Its body relaxed even further against Myra, and soon it was fully asleep with its head still resting on her lap. "We need to move it back to the containment area," the handler said, and Myra felt a strange reluctance to let go of the warm weight pressed against her, but she nodded and carefully extracted herself from beneath the sleeping cub, and the handlers moved in with a hover stretcher to transport it safely. The moment Myra stepped away, the cub made a sound even in its sleep, a soft whimpering cry that made her heart ache. "It will be okay," she told the sleeping creature, even though she knew it could not hear her. "You will be okay." Professor Thelix approached Myra with slow steps, and his expression was something she could not read. "Miss Chun," he said in a voice that was almost gentle, "what you did was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed." Myra looked up at the towering Gorvani, and she felt exhaustion settling into her bones now that the crisis had passed. It was scared. She said simply, "It was just a scared baby." The professor stared at her for a long moment, and then he made a sound that might have been a laugh if Giovanni were capable of laughing. "You are a very strange creature, Myra-chan." Behind them, the other students had begun to emerge from their various hiding spots and frozen positions, and they looked at Mira with expressions that she had never seen directed at her before, not Fernet wearing this something else. Entirely something that looked almost like respect the matriarch in her. Enclosure watched the handlers carry her cub away, and then her copper eyes found Myra one more time. The great Shadowcat made a sound that was almost like the chirping call her cub had made, and then she turned and disappeared back into the shadows of her artificial forest. Myra stood alone in the middle of the observation room, surrounded by gouged floors and shattered equipment, and 22 classmates who would never look at her the same way again. She did not feel like a hero. She just felt tired and sad and strangely empty now that the warm weight of the cub was gone from her side. "I hope you feel better soon, little one," she whispered to the empty room. And somewhere in the depths of the fauna wing, a sedated cub dreamed of copper eyes and the strange creature who had smelled like safety. The next 3 days were the strangest of Myra's life. First came the medical examinations that seemed to go on forever as doctors from 6 different species poked and prodded and scanned every inch of her body, looking for injuries that were not there. Then came the questions, so many questions. The academy administration summoned her to meeting after meeting where serious-faced officials asked her to explain exactly what had happened in the observation room. And no matter how many times she told the story, they always looked at her like she was speaking a language they could not understand. "You simply stayed still," the head administrator repeated for the 5th time, her Thesian features flickering with colors that Myra had learned to recognize as confusion. "You did not attempt to flee or defend yourself. It was scared," Myra said again, because she did not know how else to explain it. "Running would have made it chase me, and fighting would have made it attack me, so I just stayed calm." The administrators exchanged glances that were heavy with meaning Myra could not interpret, and then they sent her back to her quarters with instructions to rest and await further notice. The story of what had happened spread through the station faster than light could travel through space, and with each telling, it grew more dramatic and more impossible. Some versions claimed that Mira had wrestled the Shadowcat into submission with her bare hands using some secret human combat technique. Others whispered that she had used telepathy to control the beast's mind, a power that humans had supposedly evolved on their death world. A few of the wilder stories suggested that she was actually a Shadowcat herself who had somehow taken human form. Mira found all of it exhausting and embarrassing in equal measure. She had not done anything special. She had just refused to leave a scared baby alone, but her classmates did not see it that way. The same students who had kept their distance from her since the first day of classes now looked at her with expressions that made her uncomfortable in a completely different way. The Pelori still flinched when they saw her eyes, but now there was something else mixed with their instinctive fear. Something that looked almost like worshipped Adesians whispered to each other whenever she walked past. And she caught fragments of their conversations that included words like incredible and impossible and death world predator. Even the Giovanni, who had always treated her with careful wariness, now nodded to her in the corridors with what seemed like genuine respect. Myra hated all of it. She had spent weeks wishing that her classmates would see her as something other than a scary creature from a nightmare planet. But this was not what she had wanted. She did not want to be feared, but she did not want to be worshipped either. She just wanted to be herself on the 3rd Day after the incident, she was called to a meeting that was different from all the others, and she found herself sitting across from Professor Thelix and a Gorvani scientist she did not recognize. The scientist had tired eyes and fur that was streaked with gray, and she introduced herself as Dr. Vethry, the head researcher of the Fauna Preservation Wing, Miss Chun. Dr. Vethry began in a voice that was softer than most Gorvani. "We have a problem." Myra felt her stomach tighten with worry. "Is the cub okay?" she asked immediately. And the question seemed to surprise both of the Gorvani. "That is precisely the problem," Dr. Vethry replied as she pulled up a holographic display that showed the cub's enclosure. "The cub is not okay." The image showed the young shadow cat, pacing in circles around its containment area with movements that looked frantic and desperate. And even through the hologram, Mira could see how thin it had become. "It has not eaten since the incident," Dr. Vethry continued with worry heavy in her voice. "It barely sleeps, and it cries constantly in a vocalization we have never heard from any Shadowcat before." She touched a control and sound filled the room, and Myra felt her heart crack in her chest. It was the chirping call, the same sound the cub had made when it pressed against her side, the same sound that meant, "I am scared and I need comfort." "We have tried everything," the doctor said. "We have offered it every food source we know shadowcats eat, and we have tried to reintroduce it to its mother, but it shows no interest in any of it." Professor Thelix leaned forward with his 4 arms folded on the table. "The cub has imprinted on you, Miss Chun." Myra blinked in confusion. "Imprinted," she repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means the cub has formed a primary attachment bond with you instead of with its mother," Dr. Vethry explained. "It has decided that you are its safe place, its source of comfort and security. And without you, it is slowly dying." The words hit Myra like a physical blow. "But that does not make any sense," she protested. "I am not a shadowcat, and I only held it for a few minutes." "We know," the doctor replied with exhaustion in her voice. "Vorathi shadowcats do not imprint on non-Vorathi species, according to 200 years of research." But this cub apparently did not read that research. The hologram showed the cub collapsing against the wall of its enclosure, with its copper eyes dull and lifeless. And Myra felt tears burning in her eyes. "What can we do?" she whispered. Professor Thelix and Dr. Vethry exchanged a long look. And then the doctor spoke again. "There is a possibility, but it is unprecedented and controversial, and will require special permission from 17 different oversight committees." Myra did not care about committees or permissions or any of it. "What is the possibility?" she demanded. "You could become its guardian." The words hung in the air like something too strange to be real. "The Galactic Union has provisions for emergency bonding situations with certain protected species," Dr. Vethry explained. "If the cub's survival depends on maintaining contact with a specific individual, then that individual can be granted conditional guardianship. You would be responsible for its care and well-being," Professor Thelix added. "It would remain housed in the fauna wing, but you would have regular access to it, and it would have regular access to you." Mira stared at them both with her mind racing. "You want me to adopt a shadow cat?" "We want you to save its life," Dr. Vethry corrected gently. "The adoption is simply the legal framework that allows that to happen." Myra thought about the cub pressed against her side with its heart pounding in terror. She thought about the chirping call that meant, "I need you." She thought about how it felt to finally be needed by someone who was not afraid of her. "Yes," she said without any hesitation at all. "I will do it." Professor Thelix made that sound that might have been a laugh again. "You did not even ask about the dangers or the responsibilities." Mira looked at him with steady eyes that held no fear. "It is scared and alone, and it needs me," she said simply. "What else is there to ask?" The 2 Gorvani stared at the small human girl who had just agreed to become the guardian of one of the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. without a single question about her own safety. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Mira was already thinking about what she would name her new friend. The paperwork took 2 weeks. The oversight committees took another week, but finally, on a morning that felt like the first day of a new life, Mira Chen walked into the fauna wing with official documentation that declared her the legal guardian of a Vorathi shadowcat cub. Somewhere in the depths of the facility, a young predator lifted its head for the first time in days as a familiar scent reached its nose, the scent of safety, the scent of home. The door to the cub's enclosure slid open with a soft hiss, and Mira stepped inside, with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The space had been modified since her last visit, with soft bedding in one corner and feeding stations along the walls and a series of climbing structures that the cub had clearly ignored in favor of pacing endless circles on the floor. But the cub was not pacing now. Stood frozen in the center of the room with its copper eyes fixed on Myra and its void black fur rippling with something that looked like disbelief for a long moment. Neither of them moved then. The cub made that chirping sound and launched itself across the room with such force that it nearly knocked Myra off her feet. She braced herself and caught the young predator as it crashed into her. And suddenly she had her arms full of trembling Shadowcat as the cub pressed against her with desperate need. "Hey," Mira whispered as she sank to the floor under the weight of the cub that was now much closer to the size of a small pony than a large dog. "Hey, it is okay. I am here. I came back." The cub made sounds that were half chirp and half something else. Something that sounded almost like sobbing if Shadowcats could sob. And it pushed its head against her chest so hard that Myra had to brace herself against the wall. "I know," she murmured as she wrapped her arms around as much of the cub as she could reach. "I know you were scared and alone, and I'm so sorry it took me so long to come back." Through the observation window she could see Dr. Vethry and Professor Thelix watching with expressions of amazement, and behind them a crowd of researchers and handlers had gathered to witness what they were already calling the most significant xenobiological event in decades. Myra ignored all of them right now. There was only her and this scared baby who had somehow decided that a human girl from a death world was the safest thing in the universe. She held the cub for a long time as its trembling slowly stopped and its breathing became calm and steady. And when she finally pulled back to look at its face, she saw something in those copper eyes that made her smile trust, complete and absolute trust. "I need to give you a name," Mira said as she scratched behind the cub's ears in a spot that made its whole body relax. "I cannot keep calling you the cub forever." The young Shadowcat made a rumbling sound that vibrated through Myra's chest, and she laughed at the sensation. "How about Machi?" she suggested, thinking of the soft, sweet treats her grandmother used to make back on Earth. "You are kind of round and squishy when you are not trying to be scary." The cub that was now named Machi chirped in response and pressed even closer to Myra, as if trying to merge their bodies into one being. From that day forward, Myra's life on Station Vila 7 became something completely different. She still attended classes and studied xenobiology and ate her meals in the cafeteria. But now she spent every free moment in the fauna wing with Machi. The cub grew quickly under her care, and within a few months it had reached its full juvenile size, which was roughly the same as an earth tiger, but with 6 limbs instead of 4. Its claws could slice through metal, and its jaws could crush bone. And it was without question one of the most dangerous creatures on the entire station. It was also, according to the handlers who worked in the fauna wing, the most spoiled predator in galactic history. Machi had learned that making the chirping sound would bring Myra running, and it used this power shamelessly to demand attention and treats and belly rubs. The researchers documented everything with scientific fascination as the shadow cat displayed behaviors that had never been recorded in any member of its species. Macha played with toys that Mara brought from the station's recreation center. Machi learned to respond to its name and to simple commands like sit and stay and please stop trying to eat the scanner. Machi made the chirping sound whenever Myra left the room and made a different sound. A deep rumbling purr whenever she returned. Professor Thelix visited the enclosure one afternoon and stood beside Mira as she watched Machi chase a ball across the floor with the enthusiasm of a puppy. Your species domesticated wolves, he said slowly, as if working through a puzzle in his mind. You took predators that could kill you and turned them into companions that would die for you. Myra nodded as Machi pounced on the ball and then looked back at her with pride as if expecting praise. We have been doing it for thousands of years, she replied. Dogs and cats and horses and all sorts of animals that started out as wild creatures. Why? The professor asked with genuine confusion in his voice. Why would you choose to bond with things that could hurt you? Myra thought about the question as she watched Machi roll onto its back with all 6 legs waving in the air in a clear demand for belly rubs. Because they needed us, she finally answered. And we needed them. And somewhere along the way we figured out that being together was better than being alone. She walked into the enclosure and knelt beside Machi, and the great predator immediately curled around her with its head in her lap. Nothing should have to be scared alone, Myra said as she stroked Machi's void-black fur. Not even monsters, especially not monsters. Professor Thelix watched the human girl cradle the apex predator like it was a beloved pet. And he pulled out his datapad to make a note that he suspected would be cited in academic papers for generations to come. Human Psychological Profile Addendum. He recorded in a voice thick with wonder. They do not see predators, they see potential friends. In the enclosure adjacent to Machi's space, the shadow cat matriarch had moved to the barrier and was watching her cub curl around. The small human, the great shadow cat, had been observing these strange interactions for months now, and something in her ancient predator brain had begun to shift. The human was not a threat. The human was not prey. The human was something else entirely, something that the matriarch's instincts recognized, even if her conscious mind could not name it. Pack. The human was pack, and pack was sacred. The matriarch made the chirping sound that Machi had learned from somewhere deep in its genetics. And Mira looked up in surprise to see those copper eyes watching her through the glass. Hello, beautiful, Myra said softly. And she could have sworn she saw something like approval in the matriarch's ancient gaze. Dr. Vethri would later write a report that was read by scientists across the Galactic Union. A report that tried to explain how a single human girl had done what centuries of xenobiological research had said was impossible, but the report missed the most important point. It was not science that had allowed Mira to bond with a shadow cat. It was love, pure and simple, and offered without any expectation of anything in return. Humans did not conquer dangerous creatures or dominate them into submission. They simply loved them, and the galaxy, for all its wonders and terrors, had no defense against that. Myra-chan sat on the floor of the enclosure with Machi purring against her side, and the matriarch watching with something like respect through the glass. And she thought about how far she had come from the lonely girl who ate her meals alone and walked empty corridors. She was not alone anymore. She had found her pack, and maybe, just maybe, she had shown the galaxy something it had forgotten, that the scariest things in the universe just needed someone brave enough to love them. Machi chirped and pressed closer, and Mira smiled and held on tight. This was home now. This was family, and nothing in any galaxy could ever take that away.